So our broad question is about how cultural differences in moral foundations could explain political conflict. Now, so far we've looked at the idea that ethical attitudes in particular, not attitudes generally, but ethical attitudes in particular explain behaviours. And we've looked at moral foundations theory and the more general idea that there are at least two different kinds of moral foundation, one related to harm and one related to purity. Perhaps there are more. So far though, we haven't looked at much cultural variation. Now, when you think about cultural differences, it's quite natural to be thinking, well, you know, what we're looking at is a group over here, perhaps one where you live, and a group very far away where there's very little interaction between the two groups, and that's how you get cultural differences. But interestingly, there are quite different cultural groups that live and work together, that inhabit the same house, parts of the same family. And the most studied one of those in our area is the liberal versus conservative cultural difference. If you're like me, you move on a daily basis between a socially liberal environment and a socially conservative one. We are parts of both worlds. But they are very different. They are strikingly different, perhaps more different than we realise. So Feinberg and Willer claim, this is the third claim of 5 that we're thinking about, that liberals and conservatives possess different moral profiles regarding the 5 moral foundations. And in particular, that whereas people who are socially liberal tend to emphasise harm and unfairness, people who are socially conservative tend to focus on binding foundations, so purity, in-group, out-group issues, and authority issues. So that tends to be more of a focus when you're socially conservative than when you're socially liberal. So the claim. What's the evidence for this? Well, actually, there's a variety of quite interesting evidence. So Van Leuven and Parkes asked a bunch of Dutch students, their subjects, to rate themselves left versus right on the political orientation. Just answer the question, you know, how far left do you think you are? And then gave them the Moral Foundations questionnaire and showed that there was a relation between the two ratings, how left, right are you, and the Moral Foundations questionnaire answer, in exactly the way that Feinberg and Willer are saying. So people who regard themselves as socially liberal tend to think that harm and unfairness are the key aspects to making moral judgments, whereas things like in-group, out-group membership, authority and purity are less important. As you get more socially conservative, those all appear to have roughly equal importance. Now, I mentioned this study because it's very nice. They compared this first study with the second study where they measured political orientation using an implicit measure. So I show you something associated with a socially conservative thing, and do you spontaneously go for the good or spontaneously go towards the bad before you realise actually, you know, it's neither particularly good nor bad. So this can, using this kind of implicit measure, you can track people's political orientation this way. And what you see here is the results. I mean, there's no doubt that they're different, but you've got exactly the same pattern. You've got exactly the same pattern. Individualising foundations, harm and unfairness tend to be prioritised when you are, by the implicit measure, socially more liberal. Things are moving much more like it's just all carrying much the same weight when you tend to be more socially conservative by that implicit measure. So the thought here, and this is actually supported by a meta-analysis that I've mentioned in the notes below, is that it doesn't much matter whether we're using an explicit or an implicit measure. We're getting essentially the same pattern of cultural differences. Now, Graham and colleagues did a different study with a sample predominantly of people from the US and found, using self-reported political identity, and found basically the same thing. What's nice about Graham and colleagues is that they did 2 studies, one where they implemented the Moral Foundations questionnaire by asking people, how relevant is it to you that, I don't know, let's say this is a very disgusting action in making a judgment about whether it's right or wrong. So they asked people to weight different factors as relevant or not to decisions, and they found the pattern that Van Leuven and Parkes found with their Dutch students. But then in a different study, Graham and colleagues asked people to agree or disagree with various statements about what would be right or wrong. So, you know, somebody does this thing which is a bit disgusting, but there's no obvious harm involved. Is that right or wrong? And what they're finding here So a different way of implementing the moral foundations questionnaire. What they're finding across the two ways of implementing the questionnaire, you're getting broadly comparable results. When you're socially liberal, you don't think that purity is much of an issue. When you're socially conservative, you do tend to think that purity is just as much of an issue as harm. Very good. Marvellous. So this is quite compelling evidence. And as you'll see if you look at the notes below, this is supported with some very important caveats that we'll come to by a recent meta-analysis that covers many different samples. I should mention that Graham and colleagues also looked at effects of socio-demographic factors like age, gender, household income and education. And what they were keen to show, and I think they did show, is that it's really political identity rather than any of these other factors that drives the effect. Well, of course, they all tend to be linked. So you're more likely to be socially conservative if you're a bit older than if you're a bit younger and so on. But it's not the age itself that's driving the emphasis on purity and the rest. It seems to be political identity. That seems to be the factor that's really doing the work in this study. So that's a good result. That suggests that we have a genuine cultural difference, one that is reasonably robust across different ways of applying the moral foundations questionnaire, and also, you'll see in the notes, different ways of analysing the data from it. You're getting fundamentally the same result. So that's actually quite an encouraging result. There does seem to be a genuine cultural difference here. However, there are some objections. Some conflicting research. Now, I want to mention two bits of conflicting research. The first bit of conflicting research comes from a series of papers by Gray and colleagues, which they have written over almost a decade. They offer the view that all morality is understood through the lens of harm. So they're trying to say, look, it's ultimately all about harm. And you can see that contrasts in a fairly clear way with the ideas of moral foundations theory. So their hypothesis is that harm is central in moral cognition across moral diversity for both liberals and conservatives. And I take it that that directly contradicts what Feinberg and Willer are claiming and relying on in their argument about political conflict over climate change. So they have a series of studies, but this I think is the most compelling one, the 2015 one, where they use a survey and analyse a survey, and they say, look, we just sort of think the structure of answers is more consistent with a harm-based view. They say dyadic template, but they really mean harm versus no harm, than with a specific number of distinct moral mechanisms that are differentially expressed across liberals and conservatives. That would be moral foundations theory. Now, there's a problem here, which is that there's also some quite good evidence, I mentioned this in the notes below, that actually conflicts with their findings. So it doesn't seem that we've got very strong evidence here. The other issue is that whereas, as I'm introducing this, you might think, gosh, you know, I'm dealing with a monistic rather than pluralistic theory. Actually, there is a kind of pluralism in their theory. They're quite open about this. They think that loyalty, purity, and other kinds of concern, they label them differently, are genuine ethical concerns. It's just that they need to be understood as transformations or intermediaries of harm, values whose violation leads to perceptions of concrete harm. Now, my suspicion here is this, that they're interpreting harm quite differently from the way that harm appears in moral foundations. And secondly, that while there might be something to this, quite a lot to this, if you're describing how people in their most abstract, most reflective moments are thinking about ethical issues, they may well be disposed to write everything in terms of harm, as it were. And indeed, you can see that if you look at literature which is homophobic, explicitly homophobic, or sometimes literature which is explicitly racist, you will often see that people are trying to make a connection between what they see as failures of purity, of course other people wouldn't, and issues of harm. So there, I think there probably is something to this. But even if it's right, it may not be, even if it's right that this captures an important strand of how people think when they're thinking about matters very abstractly, wouldn't follow that this maps onto the psychological structure of our moral abilities. So what Hyde and colleagues in moral foundations theory are mainly interested in is understanding unreflective moral judgments and ordinary morally relevant action, and it may be that this isn't really picking out the factors that are most important for understanding that, but rather things that are important when we understand larger social effects and so on. So this is my take. Look, I think I want to say this. I need to mention this research by Gray and colleagues because it's a sustained attempt to provide opposition to the claim from moral foundations theory about cultural differences. I myself don't find it plausible enough to devote a lot of energy to investigating it, but I need to mention it because you might go, take a different attitude. You might take a different attitude and you might think, no, I do want to do this. So I wanted to mention this for completeness. There is a body of research which is there that you may find useful to exploit. But I think if we want to attack moral foundations theory, I think there's a better way to do that, a more direct way to do that. So Davis and colleagues attempted to replicate the results that we have just seen about moral foundations being linked to political orientation in a population in New Zealand. And what they found is that you do get that 5 factors that you expect with the moral foundations theory there. So it does seem that the questionnaire distinguishes between broadly 5 different foundations, but they don't get a connection between harm and fairness and the social conservative liberal thing. That doesn't play out. And you'll see in the meta-analysis that that's true in other groups as well. So that seems to be something that doesn't carry across different geographical locations consistently, which is interesting. Now, a second and more striking failure is this. So this is now going back to the US. This is broadly US population. But what Davis and colleagues noted is that moral foundations theory tends to be developed and studied with a sample of predominantly white people, and hasn't been studied with a broader group until they came along, I think, and other people have done it since then. And they recognised that in a North American or US context, issues of race or ethnicity interact with issues of politics and moral psychology. For that reason, they hypothesised that the binding moral foundations, things like purity, would show a weaker relationship with political conservatism in black people than in white people. And they found good support for that hypothesis across 2 independent samples in this first paper. Their suggestion then is that some of the items on the moral foundations questionnaire could conflate moral foundations with constructs like religiosity or racial identity. Now, this is closely related to the objection that we saw in the previous section, evidence for moral foundations theory, where we found a lack of scalar invariance. Scalar invariance is important because scalar invariance is what we need in order to give us justification for doing cross-cultural comparisons. What Davis and colleagues are telling us is that it seems this questionnaire isn't providing us with robust cross-cultural comparisons. It may be, we don't have evidence for this, but it's consistent with their results to think that it works with some ethnic groups, but not others, within a single geographic population. That's not a good place to find yourself in, is it? That's not a place where you're going to draw strong conclusions from the data that you have. So I take this to be an important and serious objection. So here's the thing. We want to compare means. On average, people who are socially liberal rate purity concerns low versus people who are socially conservative. They're much more concerned about purity. That's what we want to be saying here. But in doing that, we're comparing means. If we're comparing means, we need some justification for doing that. What we found is that we didn't get scalar invariance that would justify us. And when we looked across different groups, Davis and colleagues' New Zealand study, we don't find that the survey seems to work in the same way. So here there are 2 attitudes that you could take. The question we're facing really is whether the differences that we're finding between people who are socially conservative and socially liberal are merely measurement artifacts, or whether there's a genuine difference in moral foundations. Now, one conclusion that might be drawn here is that on balance it seems that measurement artifacts are likely. There's a serious risk of building a whole theory on measurement artifacts. Indeed, Davis and colleagues in a later paper say that entire literatures can develop on the basis of faulty measurement assumptions. In that case, we ought to stop right here. There's also the view that although there are some problems, on balance, moral foundations theory seems to be supported by a growing body of evidence. And although the theory itself is quite limited, it is probably useful. And in any case, there's no better alternative. Now, here's the thing. I'm not an expert in social psychology. I'm just so far out of my depth, I'm never going to see the surface again here. So I have no idea which of these two things is right. If you're going to rely on this research in writing a longer essay, you need to know. It's not enough just to take a side or pick an opinion. It's not a kind of, political decision. It's not like supporting a football team. You've got to know what the truth here is. It's very difficult to work that out. You can't rely on me to work it out for you, I'm afraid. And, to be honest, even if I did have the expertise, you know the rule. The rule is never trust a philosopher, and that, of course, applies in particular to me. So you wouldn't trust me, and you shouldn't trust me, even if I was picking a side as between these two things. You're going to have to carry out fairly serious evaluation of the evidence in order to rely or reject the claim about cultural differences. So is there any conflicting research? Yes, there's plenty, and it's quite difficult to work out what the truth here is. In any case, whichever side we come down on, we're going to have to acknowledge that there are interesting and powerful arguments on the other side. So Feinberg and Willer claim that liberals and conservatives possess different moral properties regarding the 5 moral foundations. And what we've seen is, look, it's complicated. It's actually quite difficult to work out whether or not that's true. Minimally, though, there is enough evidence to say there's probably something to this.